Hello everyone, today I'm going to tell you some stories about cheating. The first story. The scent of burnt sugar hung in the air, thick and cloying. Sarah coughed, waving a dish towel at the billowing smoke emanating from the forgotten caramel sauce on the stove. A plume curled past the fridge adorned with magnets, vacation photos, children's artwork, and a particularly garish rendering of a cartoon unicorn that had inexplicably captivated their daughter, Lily, and the unicorn, were at the root of it all, weren't they? She turned off the heat, the silence that descended amplifying the guilt gnawing at her insides. Mark wouldn't be home for another hour. Plenty of time to salvage the sauce, to scrub the kitchen clean, to force a smile onto her face and pretend everything was normal. What a distant, foreign land that felt like now that it had started innocently enough. Lily, at 6, was obsessed with the animated show, Sparkly Ponies and Magical Meadows. She knew every character, every song, every plot twist. And Sarah, always eager to indulge her daughter's passions, had signed Lily up for an animation workshop at the local art center. That's where she met David. David was the animator. He was younger than Mark, probably by a decade, with bright eyes and a mess of unruly brown hair that constantly fell into his face. He spoke with an infectious enthusiasm about frame rates and character design, his hand sketching furiously in the air as he explained the intricacies of bringing cartoons to life. Sarah had found herself drawn in, not just to the world of animation, but to David himself. He saw her, really saw her, not just as a wife, a mother, a dispenser of lunches and driver of carpools, but as a woman with a dormant creativity, someone who might have dreams beyond the mundane. He complimented her laugh, her observations, her taste in music. Things Mark hadn't done in years. The workshops turned into late-night emails, then coffee dates under the guise of discussing Lily's progress. The lines blurred, and then they shattered. One rainy afternoon, in David's cluttered studio filled with half-finished drawings and the comforting aroma of ink, they kissed. And then, they were tumbling down a slope of desperate, forbidden passion. Now, weeks later, the weight of her deception was crushing. She loved Mark, she did. He was a good man, a loving father, a reliable provider. But somewhere along the way, they'd grown complacent. They'd stopped seeing each other, truly seeing each other. Their conversations were filled with logistics and routines, not dreams and desires. David, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of possibility. He made her feel vibrant, alive, like the woman she used to be. But he wasn't her husband. He wasn't the man she had built a life with. He wasn't the father of her child. She glanced at the unicorn magnet again. A childish fantasy, a symbol of Lily's innocent joy. And Sarah had tainted it, layered it with a shadow of her own guilt. The key turned in the lock. Mark was home. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hair and forcing a smile. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Dinner's almost ready." Mark kissed her on the cheek, his eyes tired. "Rough day. Lily okay?" "She's great," Sarah said, a lump forming in her throat. She drew another unicorn. "You should see it." As Mark headed upstairs to see his daughter, Sarah knew she couldn't keep living this lie. The burnt caramel sauce was a metaphor for her life, a sweet intention gone sour, leaving behind a bitter taste and a smoky haze. She had a choice to make. A painful, difficult choice. But it was a choice she had to face, for the sake of her marriage, for the sake of her daughter, and for the sake of her own soul. The kitchen suddenly felt very small, the weight of her secrets pressing in on her. The unicorn magnet seemed to mock her with its innocent sparkle. It was time to clean up this mess, one way or another. The question was, could she? And at what cost? The second story. The dust tasted like betrayal. Martha coughed, pulling her shawl tighter around her, but it did little to keep out the gritty particles swirling in the perpetual twilight of the mining town. Harmony Gulch. A name that felt like a cruel joke now. Harmony was the last thing she felt. She watched Thomas disappear down the shaft, the cage creaking and groaning like an old man settling into bed. The image was familiar, etched into her mind by years of waving him off each morning. Years of scrubbing coal dust from his skin, years of the quiet, predictable rhythm of their life together. Years she now questioned that it had started subtly, like a slow leak in a well. The loneliness, gnawing at her bones, a byproduct of the long, isolated days. Thomas, a good man, a hard-working man, but a man who came home exhausted and preoccupied with the ever-thinning veins of ore. He stopped seeing her, she realized, lost in the depths of the earth. That's when Caleb appeared. He was younger, a drifter, with eyes the color of polished hematite and a smile that promised adventure. He wasn't from Harmony Gulch, and that, in itself, was a lure. He saw her. He noticed the way the sun caught the copper in her hair, the way she hummed while she hung laundry, the weariness in her eyes. He brought her wildflowers, gnarled and hardy like the land they grew on, and told her stories of places beyond the dust and the drudgery. He listened. Thomas hadn't listened in years. One scorchingly hot afternoon, while the town slumbered, lulled by the drone of the mine and the cicadas, Caleb's listening turned into more. Martha, starved for connection, for attention, for something else, found herself caught in his orbit. The guilt had been immediate, sharp and agonizing, but so had the fleeting sense of freedom, of being seen. Now, watching the cage descend, she felt the guilt weighing her down like a sack of coal. She'd tried to bury it, to pretend it hadn't happened, but the truth clung to her like the dust, impossible to shake off. Each shared meal with Thomas felt like swallowing shards of glass. Each peck on the cheek, a blatant lie. The rumors had started, whispers carried on the wind, catching in the curtains of the saloon, echoing in the general store. She saw the sidelong glances, the knowing smirks. Harmony Gulch was a small town. Secrets didn't stay buried for long. Caleb was gone now, vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. He'd said he was moving on, chasing a new load, a new adventure. He hadn't said goodbye, just slipped away, leaving Martha to face the consequences of her own actions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, she walked towards her small, ramshackle house. Thomas would be home soon. She had a choice to make. Continue the lie, a slow, agonizing erosion of trust and love? Or confess, risking everything she had built, facing the wrath of a good man betrayed. The dust swirled around her feet, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of Harmony Gulch, the darkness mirrored in her own heart. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever she chose, the taste of betrayal would linger, a bitter residue on her tongue, for a long, long time. The third story, the scent of lavender and disappointment hung thick in the air. Clara traced the floral pattern of the wallpaper in their bedroom, a room that suddenly felt foreign, suffocating. 10 years. 10 years she had painstakingly built this life with Mark, a life of cozy Sunday mornings, meticulously planned vacations, and a comforting, predictable routine. But predictability, she realized, had become a gilded cage. Mark, a successful accountant, was a good man. Solid, reliable, and kind. He just lacked a certain spark. A spark Clara hadn't even realized she was missing until she saw it blazing in the eyes of Victor, the hammer, Ramirez. Victor was a whirlwind of sweat and sinew, a raw, untamed force she had encountered at a charity gala. She'd been assigned to escort him, a last-minute replacement for a colleague. He'd looked completely out of place in his ill-fitting tuxedo, his hands, usually wrapped in boxing gloves, fidgeting nervously. But when he spoke, his voice a low rumble, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, locked onto hers, Clara felt a tremor run through her she hadn't experienced since her youth. He was everything Mark wasn't: impulsive, unpredictable, and intensely alive. Their affair had been a reckless, intoxicating rush. Stolen moments in dimly lit hotel rooms, the scent of sweat and liniment clinging to her clothes, a constant hum of guilt and exhilaration vibrating beneath her skin. The guilt had finally become unbearable. She knew she couldn't live a lie, not anymore. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling. He looked up from his laptop, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" You seem tense. Sweetheart. The endearment felt like a branding iron on her skin. I have something to tell you. The next few minutes were a blur of halting words and choked sobs. She confessed everything, the lavender scent in the room morphing into something bitter and acrid. Mark listened, his face slowly draining of color, his eyes hardening with each syllable. When she finished, a silence descended, so profound it felt like pressure against her eardrums. He didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't even move. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Victor Ramirez. A boxer. The way he said it, the disdain dripping from each word, was a punch to the stomach harder than any Victor could deliver in the ring. Yes, she whispered, shame burning in her throat. He stood up, his movements stiff and controlled. I need to think, he said, and walked out of the room, leaving Clara alone with the shattered fragments of her life. Days turned into weeks. Mark remained in the house, a ghost in his own home. They barely spoke, the silence between them a chasm too wide to bridge. He still went to work, still ate dinner, though he barely touched his food, still slept in the same bed, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a glacial chill. One afternoon, Clara found a small, crumpled piece of paper on the kitchen counter. It was a ticket to Victor's next fight. Underlined in black ink was the seat number, right near the ringside. Clara felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. Fury? Confusion? Manipulation? She didn't know. On the night of the fight, she found herself standing in the swirling chaos of the arena, the air thick with the smell of sweat and anticipation. She found her seat, the roar of the crowd deafening. Then, he appeared. Victor. He looked magnificent, sculpted in sweat and determination. As he stepped into the ring, his eyes scanned the crowd, searching. They locked on her. For a moment, time stood still. A faint smile touched his lips, a silent acknowledgement. But then, his gaze shifted, landing on Mark, who was sitting a few rows behind her. His smile vanished. The fight was brutal. Victor fought with a ferocity Clara had never seen, each punch delivered with a savage power. But he seemed distracted, his focus wavering. He took hit after hit, his face swelling, blood dripping from his nose. In the final round, he was knocked down. He lay there, gasping, staring up at the lights. Clara wanted to scream, to run to him, but she was frozen in place, caught between her past and her present. Victor struggled to his feet, his eyes meeting Mark's. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of regret, perhaps even shame. Then, with a final, desperate surge, he lunged forward, only to be met with a crushing blow that sent him crashing to the canvas. The referee counted him out. As the arena erupted in cheers, Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She ran out of the arena, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where she was going, what she was going to do. All she knew was that she had lost everything. She had traded the comfort of her predictable life for a fleeting moment of passion, and in doing so, she had broken 2 hearts, including her own. She had craved the spark, the raw, untamed fire. But now, she was left with nothing but ashes. The lavender scent in her bedroom, she knew, would forever be tainted with the bitter taste of regret. And the echoes of the referee's count, 8, 9, 10, would haunt her for the rest of her days. Because sometimes, the things we crave the most are the very things that destroy us. The fourth story, the scent of turpentine and regret hung heavy in the air, a noxious perfume Ethan couldn't shake. It clung to his clothes, his skin, a constant, silent accusation. He stood in the doorway of their meticulously clean, minimalist kitchen, watching Amelia stir her tea. The ceramic spoon clicked against the mug, a sharp, precise sound that amplified the vast emptiness between them. Amelia, with her sleek, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and her eyes the color of polished slate, was always precise. In her work as a financial analyst, in her perfectly curated home, in her unwavering loyalty to him. That's what made it so much worse that he'd met Clara at an art gallery opening. She was vibrant, a chaotic whirlwind of color and passion, a stark contrast to Amelia's controlled elegance. Clara saw beauty in the broken, the flawed, the things Amelia diligently smoothed over and perfected. And he, in his midlife malaise, had fallen prey to her siren song. He'd told himself it was a temporary escape, a burst of reckless creativity in a life suffocating under the weight of routine. He admired Clara's audacity, her fearless self-expression. He even started sketching again, something he hadn't done since college. Clara, with her wild, untamed hair and paint-smeared hands, had made him feel alive again, but the guilt, a relentless tide, had eventually crashed over him. He'd confessed to Amelia, the words tumbling out in a desperate, shameful torrent. Amelia had listened, her face a mask of carefully constructed composure. She hadn't screamed, hadn't cried, hadn't even raised her voice. She'd simply nodded, a single, decisive motion that felt like a death knell. Now, weeks later, the silence was the most potent weapon. They existed in a fragile peace, a delicate dance around the raw, gaping wound he'd inflicted. Amelia had chosen to stay, a decision he both craved and dreaded. He wanted forgiveness, but he knew he didn't deserve it. "How was work?" he finally asked, the question sounding hollow, rehearsed. Amelia took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the steam swirling above the mug. "Busy," she replied, her voice flat. He longed to reach out, to cup her cheek, to beg for absolution, but his hand remained suspended in the air. He was terrified of shattering the precarious equilibrium. He thought of Clara. He hadn't seen her since his confession. He'd imagined her devastated, heartbroken, but she had simply packed her paints, kissed him goodbye, and said, "You don't belong in my world, not really." Her words, sharper than any blade, had cut him deeper than he'd expected. He'd realized, with a jolt of clarity, that his fascination with Clara had been fueled by a desire for something he lacked within himself, a vibrancy he desperately craved but couldn't create. He hadn't truly seen Clara, the woman, the artist. He'd only seen the reflection of his own desires. Later that evening, Amelia went to her study, the click-clack of her keyboard a steady pulse in the quiet house. Ethan wandered into the spare room, which he had, in his brief fling with artistic expression, converted into a makeshift studio. Canvases leaned against the wall, covered in half-finished sketches and bold, abstract splatters. He picked up a brush, the familiar weight comforting in his hand. He looked at the canvas, the chaotic jumble of color reflecting his own fractured state. He dipped the brush in a jar of deep blue paint, the color of Amelia's eyes. He began to paint, not with the abandon he'd fostered with Clara, but with a newfound sense of purpose, a quiet determination to rebuild, to create something lasting out of the debris of his mistakes. He didn't know if Amelia would ever truly forgive him. He didn't know if they could ever recapture the love they'd once shared. But he knew he had to try. He had to earn her trust back, one brushstroke, one thoughtful gesture, one act of unwavering devotion at a time. He had to learn to see the beauty in the quiet, enduring strength of Amelia, the woman he had almost lost. He had to learn to create a masterpiece, not on a canvas, but in the messy, complicated reality of their life. The fifth story, the humid Louisiana air hung heavy, mirroring the weight in Clara's chest. The cicadas buzzed a relentless rhythm, a soundtrack to the simmering guilt gnawing at her insides. 10 years. 10 years with Daniel, a man whose kindness was woven into the very fabric of her being, a man she loved, or thought she did. Daniel was predictable. He woke at 6 a.m., made her coffee with precisely 2 sugars, and kissed her forehead before heading out to the bakery, his flour-dusted apron his armor against the world. He was safe, solid, a warm hearth on a cold night. Then came Hurricane Raphael. The storm battered their small town, leaving behind a trail of destruction and displaced lives. Clara, a social worker, found herself coordinating the relief effort. That's when she met Kaze. Kaze was everything Daniel wasn't. A whirlwind of energy, a kaleidoscope of charisma. He was a traveling rapper, his rhymes raw and honest, his heart bleeding for the victims of the storm. He volunteered his time, his energy, and his music, bringing a much-needed spark of joy to the devastated community. He saw Clara. Really saw her. Not as Daniel's wife, the woman who made perfect jambalaya and kept a meticulously clean house, but as Clara, the woman with fire in her eyes and a passion for helping others. He saw the caged bird yearning to fly, the soul craving something more. One late night, after a particularly grueling day distributing supplies, they found themselves alone, sharing a bottle of lukewarm beer on the porch of the community center. The air vibrated with unspoken tension. He recited a verse he'd written about her, a verse that spoke of her strength, her beauty, her hidden desires. The words hung in the air, a bridge she couldn't help but cross. The affair was a fever dream, a stolen moment in the eye of the storm. A dangerous, exhilarating escape from the quiet routine of her life. Kaze was a lightning strike, illuminating the parts of herself she had long forgotten, but the storm always passes. Kaze packed his bags, his tour beckoning him onward. He kissed her goodbye, a lingering, passionate kiss that left her breathless and terrified. Now, weeks later, the evidence of the affair was etched on her soul. The way she flinched when Daniel touched her, the way she avoided his eyes, the constant metallic taste of guilt on her tongue. Daniel, bless his oblivious heart, noticed she was off. He brought her flowers, made her favorite peach cobbler, tried to coax a smile from her with his gentle humor. Each act of kindness was a fresh stab wound. One evening, as she was meticulously folding laundry, Daniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You've been quiet lately, Clara. Is everything all right?" Her breath hitched. This was it. The moment of truth. She could lie, pretend, bury the secret deeper. But the lie was already suffocating her. She pulled away, her hands clammy. "Daniel, we need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy and pregnant. He knew. She saw it in the flicker of understanding in his kind, patient eyes. He had known all along, perhaps, a silent dread he had kept buried for her sake. The confession was a torrent, years of suppressed desires and unspoken resentments tumbling out alongside the details of her infidelity. The sound of Daniel's heartbreak was a low, guttural moan that tore through her. He didn't yell, didn't scream. He just stood there, his face crumbling, the man she thought she knew shattering into a million pieces before her eyes. "Kaze," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "A rapper?" The casual disdain in his voice, the utter bewilderment, was almost worse than rage. It was a dismissal, not just of Kaze, but of her. Of her needs, her desires, her pain. The fallout was inevitable. He couldn't forgive her, not completely. The trust, the foundation of their life together, was irrevocably broken. He moved out, leaving behind a house filled with the ghosts of their shared history. Clara was alone, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. Kaze's music was now a constant reminder of her betrayal, a haunting melody of what could have been. She had traded the predictable comfort of her life with Daniel for a fleeting moment of passion, a reckless gamble that had cost her everything. Now, she was left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild a life from the ashes, knowing that the scars would never truly fade. The storm had passed, but the damage lingered, a constant reminder of the day she traded loyalty for desire. And in the end, she was left wondering if the brief thrill was worth the enduring pain. Perhaps, she thought, the caged bird should have stayed in its gilded cage. The freedom she craved had only trapped her in a prison of her own making.